Some of our best information for Hatshepsut as king comes from the ancient city of Thebes, modern-day Luxor, and much of it comes from a particular temple, the Temple of Karnak. And I'm showing you a series of images to show you how archaeologists get access to this information. There are pylons at Karnak, which are like big, giant gateways that ancient Egyptians filled up with old fill and old rock. And when buildings were taken down and dismantled, then those blocks would go inside of a new pylon. So there are a number of pylons that were created after Hatshepsut's reign that contain blocks from Hatshepsut's reign, which helps us understand something, that all of Hatshepsut's buildings were taken down by the kings after her so that she was erased and put into these pylon structures. And I'll show you what this looks like. If you look at this image here, you can see all of the fill that's inside of one of these pylons and get an idea of how the archaeologists then take these blocks out, put them into block yards, organize them, set them up, and then reconstruct the building that was once there. So what you see right now is an image of Hatshepsut's red chapel, reconstructed by archaeologists out of the surviving blocks. I would say that about 50% of them survive, and they've put them back together into what they think the chapel looked like. We call it the red chapel because it was made of this pinkish, reddish, orangish quartzite stone, very hard stone to carve. And it would have held in Karnak Temple the bark of Amun-Re, that boat-shaped device that priests would have carried on carrying poles on their shoulders. And inside of that boat-shaped thing, there would have been a shrine. And that's where you would have put the solid gold statue of the god Amun-Re and then shrined him up into that. Then the priests would have held up this bark on the carrying poles on their shoulders, and they would have left this chapel, left the temple of Karnak, the walls of it, and would have then brought the god out amongst the people. This was an oracle procession. This would have been an extremely important event in the lives of the ancient Egyptians who witnessed it. And indeed, this bark, this Amun-Re, this god statue, was so important to Hatshepsut that she records 2 stories in this bark chapel in text form that claim that it was during one of those festivals when the god was brought outside of the temple that she was marked for kingship. And the story is an amazing one. She leaves out all of the details. She leaves out who was king at the time when this happened. But she tells us that the priests came out of the temple and that all of a sudden they were rudderless, that they didn't know which direction to go. We have to understand that when the priests are carrying the bark aloft on their shoulders, that the gods are communing with them. They're in their brains in a way, telling them which direction to go, what decision to make. If somebody stops in front of them and says, my Lord, I have this decision, what should I do? Then the priests know to say, do this or do that. They know to point the bark in a certain way. This is all meant to be this sacred communication between the heavens and the earth. Well, the bark comes out and it is rudderless. The god is not telling the bark what to do, according to the text. The Egyptians around them in this festival start to freak out. They start to weep. They start to look down. They all realize that God has somehow abandoned them. And then all of a sudden, the priests pull up and they start to move very quickly. So the god is communicating to them. It's gotten very dramatic now in the story. She's recording this in her hieroglyphic text. And the gods go this way, and then they turn, and then they go again, and they turn, and they land right in front of Hatshepsut. She's a girl. She's probably God's wife of Amun at this point, though she's not very clear about it in the text. She throws herself on her belly in front of the bark of Amun. The god statue is inside of this shrine. She holds up her arms and she says, my father, what would you have me do? And essentially, she's done it right there. She and her priests have manufactured this perfect way of publicly proclaiming that her kingship, her power, in whatever form it takes, regency, kingship, along this path, is unassailable. It cannot be criticized that the god is asking her to do this. She uses her ideological understanding, and it is a very deep and profound ideological understanding, and probably one she believed in as well, to pave her way along this strange journey of kingship, to constantly tell her people, hey, I'm not doing this because I'm ambitious. I'm not doing this because I need to be king. only doing what my father is asking me to do. My father Thutmose the first, the king, my father Amun-Re, the god. I'm only in it because I want Egypt to be safe. Hatshepsut understood that a female's ambition, particularly a female's political ambition, is distasteful for most people to see. She knew that she had to shield it in ideology and make it clear to everyone that she was only doing what the gods were asking her to do. So here's another image from this red chapel that shows Hatshepsut directly in front of the god Amun-Re, offering him 2 obelisks that she has had quarried out of the red granite quarries. And she is in this text. She's saying right here, this is like quotation marks in ancient Egyptian. This is an utterance by her. And she's saying that she set up these 2 great obelisks for her father Amun-Re in this precious broad hall in the temple of Karnak. She says that they're covered with electrum along their length. So they weren't just red granite obelisks, but they were actually sheathed in electrum. Yes, there is a phallic aspect to all of this that the Egyptians are clear about in other texts. But she's also covering these light catchers, if you will, because they're about 10 stories high, with a silvery golden metal, a precious metal, to show that the god is actually coming into this temple space. And the god, in return, over here on this side in front of Amun-Re, here's his speech. A speech by Amun-Re, lord of the thrones of the 2 lands, says, "My daughter of my body, Hatshepsut, may I give to you a long reign of millions of years upon the throne of Egypt." So she gives him obelisks. He gives her in return the throne, a very long reign, a prosperous reign. And we see an exchange, a give and take between king and god. Now, we cannot forget that her nephew and co-king is existing this whole time as she's moving from regency to kingship. And he's growing up. And by the time this red chapel is built, the kid is probably 16 years old. So he's now well-educated, being trained in military arts. Thutmose III will actually end up being a very, very great general. And she now has to publish him as a part of her rule. And this is how she decides to do it. She masculinizes herself first. Second, she shows herself and her co-king as absolute twinsies. They look exactly alike. They may be wearing different crowns in some of these depictions, but essentially they have the same body, the same face, the same stature, and yet she shows herself first. The only way to differentiate these 2 is by looking at the names. On top of her name, we have Mat-Ka-Ra. On top of his name, we have Men-Kheper-Ra. She is in front, he is behind, but they are both doing ritual activity for the gods. It's a way for her to say to us, I'm protecting his kingship. I'm in front of him, protecting him. I'm making sure that he will make it to the finish line, but he is the same as me and I am the same as him. The same spirit of divine kingship is in both of us. You should not be threatened by my kingship. Her moment of crowning is shown in this red chapel. When she has this set up, she's already been king for a number of years, but she shows us her different levels of crowning by different gods with different crowns. And you imagine the Egyptians had lots of different kinds of crowns. She shows this again and again in her propagandistic campaign. And here she is kneeling before the god Amun-Re, who is putting the crown upon her head, and the goddess Hathor is offering her power and life. And she's depicted as a man. You can't even tell that she's a woman here. The only way you would know is by looking at the text and seeing the Mat-Ka-Ra here and looking at this duck sign, which is the sign for sun, and you see a little bread loaf behind it, which makes it a daughter. So she is the beloved daughter of Amun-Re in this text. Here she is with her nephew. Nephew is here, Hatshepsut is here, and they are following the bark of Amun-Re. So here you get an idea of what it looked like to have these carrying poles, this boat-shaped shrine. Here's the shrine on top with the god Amun-Re inside, and all of these shaven priests are carrying the god's bark outside of the temple to interact with the public. And the co-kings are following along behind this bark. Hatshepsut is most famous today because of her building program. In many ways, her story has to be resurrected from all of the architectural history that we have around us. And volumes have been written on Hatshepsut, but very little about her decision-making as king, more about she built this building, she set up these obelisks, she made this statue. Her story is one that you have to piece together from all of the materials that she left behind. Well, she left behind some pretty amazing structures, and one of them was her Temple of Millions of Years, which for me, and the way I want to present it to you in this class, is a publication of her rule, a publication of her kingship, a publication of her justification for that kingship, despite the fact that she was a woman. So let's jump into how she did that. One of the methods of doing that was to show a divine birth mythology, to claim that her mother was visited by the god Amun-Re himself when he possessed her father, Thutmose I, and that she was the divine issue of the god, that she is indeed of the god's effluence. This is what she is claiming. And she depicts it very clearly in her divine birth mythology when she shows the god Amun-Re and the goddess touching hands. That's the moment of sexual congress depicted right here. We're not going to get any sexier than that. And they're held up aloft in the heavens. This would have been an amazing orgasmic moment for her mother Ahmes as she's held aloft in the heavens and she's having this sexual relation with Amun-Re himself. And he's putting that life to her nose. That's Hatshepsut moving into her body. Egyptologists of the past have looked at this and said, this is audacious or it's insecure of Hatshepsut. Look at how she's claiming to be the offspring of the gods themselves. Indeed, it's not audacious and it's not far-reaching and it's not insecure. Hatshepsut is only doing what kings before her did in Dynasty 12. And another king after her, Amenhotep III in Dynasty 18, will show the exact same reliefs. So Hatshepsut is a traditionalist. She's fitting herself into the traditional propagandistic scheme of a male king, but she's doing it as a female. Here we see her mother Ahmes, pregnant, about to give birth, tiny belly, but there is a baby in there nonetheless, according to the scenes. And here we see the gods creating her body on a potter's wheel. The first one is her. The second one is the divine kingship. So the spirit, the spark of kingship is being modeled alongside her. The two go hand in hand. The next thing that Hatshepsut has carved in her propagandistic message to the world, her support of kingship, is a set of reliefs that document an expedition to faraway lands, lands that maybe were in Eritrea or Somalia or even Yemen. Egyptologists argue ad nauseum about where this land of Punt was. What we do know is Hatshepsut was very proud to have gone there, and she documents it for us very, very clearly. She shows us crazy details about having gone to this place. She shows us the chieftainess of this land of Punt, who is supposedly misshapen and fat and strange looking, next to her husband, the chief, who is a normal man. But she makes sure that she includes that local color to say, look, I really did this. I sent this expedition off with the blessing of the god Amun-Re, and they returned with all of these goods. And I am a king that makes sure that trade continues in Egypt. She brought back a number of incense trees, dozens of precious incense trees. When you read in the Bible about frankincense and myrrh, that's what it is. It's resin from a tree, worth its weight in gold. Hatshepsut was pretty canny. She brought back a number of balls of incense, tens of thousands of these balls of incense in the cargo loads of the boats coming back from Punt. But she also brought back dozens of trees, roots and all, to plant in Egypt so this incense would continue to grow in Egypt. And she planted 2 of them in front of her Temple of Millions of Years at Thebes. Another part of her propagandistic campaign at her Temple of Millions of Years was to very clearly publish her relationship to her father, the great Thutmose I, she being his eldest daughter, the offspring that he chose to be king. She includes a relief panel that shows Thutmose I introducing her to his elites as his chosen king. Egyptologists have looked at this and said, it's a lie, she's being disingenuous. Is she? She is king at the point that she's creating this structure. She is the daughter of this Thutmose I, this great king. So did he actually in his lifetime introduce her to his courtiers as his chosen next king? Not necessarily. But if you think of it in the Egyptian mindset, in the way that mysterious things happen in this earth, he did do that. He did that as a great god from beyond the grave, working with Amun-Re, engineer her path, a very unexpected, a very circuitous path to the kingship. She's only on the throne because she's a king's daughter, is what she's saying. So her connection to her father must be very clearly published in this Temple of Millions of Years. And she depicts him again and again. And here is one such depiction of her father, Thutmose I. We actually have more depictions of her father, Thutmose I, from her reign than we do from his own reign. So she made more depictions of him than he made of himself. Now let's look at how Hatshepsut negotiated her path from female king in her depictions to completely masculinized king. I've already shown you reliefs where she just looks like a man. She's got the buff biceps and she's toned like a man. There's no hint of breasts or anything like that. It seems to have just popped out of nowhere, just a fait accompli. It's something that just happened. Well, actually, there is evidence that it took time for Hatshepsut to get to this point of depicting herself as a man. And you can see it in statue form. The statues that I'm showing you right now, and I'll show you 3 different ones, are all in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And they've all been pieced together slowly and painstakingly by conservators who found them as small bits of stone in front of her Temple of Millions of Years. That should make you think, why were they all smashed up, these statues? We'll get to that in a bit. But the statues, looking at them from one to the next, help you to understand that Hatshepsut was able to show herself as a female king at the beginning. Then she tried to androgynize it, but not completely. And then she had to go all in and masculinize herself at the end. So look at this first image here. She's wearing a dress with the Nemes headdress, and she's showing herself in the manner of Sobek Nofru as a female king. Not too many surprises here. It's what we would expect. The breasts are clear, the dress is clear, the femininity is clear, but the Nemes headdress is kingship incarnate, and she's layering that onto her feminine self. This, for whatever reason, does not seem to be satisfactory to Hatshepsut, or we would presume to anyone else. And so she messes with this form, and we see this extraordinary statue from the Met that shows her as a kind of androgynous being. This beautiful limestone piece, and it is my favorite image of Hatshepsut from anywhere, shows her with a naked chest. But she doesn't have any nipples, as you would see with an Egyptian female, but she has breasts. And not only that, she's very gracile. Her form is a delicate one. She doesn't have strong shoulders or a wide chest in any way. Her legs are very delicate. Her feet are very delicate. Her face is gorgeous. Her face is this heart-shaped, delicate, smiling Barbie face. And it's not something that you would readily associate with a man. It's something that seems to be very much a woman's. But she's topless. She's wearing the masculine kilt. She's not wearing a dress. So it's this strange combination of male and female, which to me smacks of Hatshepsut not wanting to fully masculinize, wanting to somehow keep her femininity in whatever way that she could. But notice that in this statue, she's calling herself the mistress of the 2 lands. And if we zoom in on this statue and look at that Neb sign, it's a basket. And here we see Neb, and then you see those two lines. Those are Tawi. Neb Tawi means the lord of the 2 lands. But you see that little bread loaf, that little sign in between. That's the T that marks the feminine. So we have Nebet Tawi. So she is clarifying in the text, for those who can read and write, that she is indeed a woman. The statue is something that is meant to complicate, to show the ideal and the perfected. If you need kingship to be masculine, yes, we can show that. The text is saying the truth, in a sense. She's a daughter, she's a mistress, she's a woman, and the text never strays from that in these statues. But eventually, Hatshepsut decides that she needs to fully masculinize. And so here we see the end result of what she is forced to do to match her co-king. She can't expect the kingship to fit to her. She has to fit to the kingship, and she has to fit to her nephew's growing and empowered kingship. She has to be a double to him, in a sense. So you've got the buff biceps, you've got the wide chest, you've got a face that is much broader, that looks more masculine. Make no mistake, the text is still going to name her as a daughter, as a mistress, as a female. But anybody who can't read and write is going to understand their co-kingship as being two men in the position of king rather than a woman and a man. And think about this for a little bit, how difficult this is for Hatshepsut to negotiate. She's created a co-regency, which is not that strange. That's something that the ancient Egyptians would do if they wanted to place a young man on the throne before his time, maybe when he was 12 or 13 or 14, and he could learn alongside an elder king. But Hatshepsut has turned this around. She's the one that's coming onto the throne second, but she's put herself in the primary place as the chief king, the first king, the one that's always depicted first. The king who was on the throne first is masculine. She is feminine, but she is the older one. So it's kind of a mess of a co-regency that she has to constantly negotiate. She has to do so in her statuary. She has to do so in her reliefs. She has to constantly work vis-a-vis her nephew. So what happens to Hatshepsut? Where does she end up? What's the end result of her kingship? Well, she was very powerful. She left Egypt better than she found it. She ruled during a time of prosperity. She made everybody rich. The mines are working at full tilt. The gold is pouring into Egypt. She's able to control Nubia. She's extraordinarily successful, and she broadcasts that to her people. From what we can tell, she dies a natural death. And from what we can tell, she is buried in state as a king in the Valley of the Kings. She sets up her nephew, Thutmose III, for the best kingship Egypt is going to see in some time. He's going to end up invading the Levant and making Egypt's empire bigger than it has been in decades. Not since 12th dynasty have we seen an Egyptian empire of this size and importance. So she's done everything right. Thutmose III will finish monuments for her. He will finish her red chapel. He'll carve his name up at the top, but he'll keep it there in Karnak. He's going to finish other parts of her temple structures and treat her with respect. We have to assume that he understood that if she hadn't been there to protect his kingship, he wouldn't have been king at all. Maybe there were complications, maybe there was some bitterness or antagonism between the two of them, but for a good 20 years after her death, he allows her image to haunt his steps. And her image is everywhere. She's building during her reign everywhere of high quality in Karnak and Luxor and in other parts of Egypt. But then something happens. About 25 years into his reign, Thutmose III decides he can't have her around anymore. She is complicating his kingship. And she is complicating something very specific. Something that is all about patriarchy, that is all about masculine kingship. She is complicating the succession. She is complicating his transfer of power from father to son. We don't get the specifics of it. They're never going to go into the realpolitik of this problem. But we do see that Thutmose III orders men to go throughout Egypt and to remove her name, her figures, her images, to chisel her out wherever he can, to replace her images with images of his father, her dead husband, Thutmose II, or his grandfather, Thutmose I, to take out the name of a big colossal she had carved for herself and to put in the name of his father or grandfather in its place. This work is competing with his own construction of his own monuments, but he doesn't care. He needs Hatshepsut out of the way. So why would he even need to do this? Why would he wait so long? If he hated the woman and they had some sort of horrible relationship, then why wouldn't he have started doing this right after she had died? He doesn't, because it's at the end of his life when he's trying to put a boy onto the throne after him who's not related to Hatshepsut's family that it becomes problematic. Indeed, Thutmose III may have even bypassed sons of his own to be king, who were related to Hatshepsut's family, maybe even born to Hatshepsut's daughter, Neferure, his own half-sister. What if he had sons with Neferure, his half-sister, Hatshepsut's daughter, whom he's skipping. He doesn't want to give the kingship to them. It's complicating things. Maybe he's sick of all of the female power. Maybe Neferure is becoming problematic for him as well. And I should point out, even though I don't have time to do it in this lecture, that Neferure's images are being destroyed as well. She becomes persona non grata. We can't even talk about what happened to Neferure because her images are so well removed from the Egyptian landscape. But for whatever reason, when Thutmose III picks his next king, he does something very strange. He picks a young king. He could have been 14, 15, 16 years old. He's been on the throne for ages. He could have picked a grown man. I'm sure he has grown sons that he could have tapped to be king after him and said, okay, you're crown prince. And then he could have just finished out his years with a kind of deep sigh and been like, okay, my kingship will go on and we're good. But he doesn't do that. He picks a young kid who needs training. He picks a young kid who needs justification because he makes him co-king in a co-regency alongside him. He does the crowning of this young kid before he's dead. So we see Thutmose III with his co-king Amenhotep II ruling alongside him. It's like he knows that somebody's going to come in and try to take the kingship after his death. So he's like, no, no, no. I know who I want to be king after me. I know I don't want any of these pesky, powerful females to try to run my show. I'm going to do it myself. I'm picking this kid. He's not connected to Hatshepsut or Neferure. I'm done with it. Erase her everywhere. In a sense, you can think of it as that balance that I was talking about before between the king on the one hand and the royal females on the other. The royal females, Hatshepsut and her daughter Neferure, have gotten way too powerful for Thutmose III to deal with. And when he chooses Amenhotep II as his next king, that's his chance to push back. And he pushes back against those royal females in his succession, presumably by going around Hatshepsut's family in whatever way he can, justifying for a different king. He has to erase her and Neferure when he does so. And then to make it more interesting, after Hatshepsut's death, he makes sure that important priestess positions, like the god's wife of Amen, no longer go to daughters of his, no longer go to royal women, king's daughters, king's sisters, king's mothers. He puts that position of authority into the hands of an unconnected wife, a non-royal commoner woman, a woman whom he could control, a woman that takes power away from the royal female. So there is a pushback at work here. Hatshepsut did it all so well that Thutmose III is now going to have to push against her authority. And then my final point is, Hatshepsut did everything so well that he was able to easily reassign all of the great things that she did to Thutmose I, Thutmose II, which is why she's not a part of our cultural memory. She doesn't make it into the history books very easily. Success is a dangerous thing because it can be so easily reassigned. Failure, it's unusual, it's different. You can talk about Cleopatra getting bitten by an asp or Jezebel being thrown out of a window. Really interesting stories that are associated with a particular woman in a particular place. Doing everything right traditionally for Egypt is boring. And it's something that anybody can take credit for and say, I did that. And that's why we don't remember Hatshepsut's name. That's why we can't pronounce it. So I understand that we went through a tremendous amount of history for Hatshepsut too fast. Understand that it's as painful to me as anybody else. I know a whole lot more about this than I'm able to tell you. But also know that I did write a book on this subject, thank goodness, and you can look there to get any other information that you'd like to know about our dear Hatshepsut.